Yes.
Okay. So should we start?
Please.
Okay. So good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to Tokyo Philosophy Project. This is the Tokyo Philosophy Project Conversation with Philosopher channel. This is a co-organized by Kelas, Isolasi, Indonesia. Now, Tokyo Philosophy Project is organized by a group of philosophers led by a Japanese philosopher called the Morioka Masahiro. And they're doing this YouTube channel for having a conversation with philosophers from around the world. And Kelas Isolasi is a group of Indonesian philosophy students organize these events online. So we decided to do this co-joint co-host event. And first 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes will be a conversation with a philosopher for Tokyo Philosophy Project. And then next 1 hour, we would just open up the table for discussions among the Kelas Isolasi Indonesia. Now, so this is the first joint Tokyo, Bandung, Indonesia, Tokyo, Japan joint philosophy project. And they asked me to host this event from Belgium. So it's a little bit of a confusion of time zone. But this is what we're going to do. We're going to start having a conversation with philosophers from around the world and continue this world philosophy project from around the world. So the first speaker, by the way, my name is Takeshi MORISATO. I'm the co-host of this Tokyo Philosophy Project conversation with the philosopher. First guest is Dr. Kyle Shuttleworth. Do you see the screen with Kyle? Dr. Shuttleworth is a postdoctoral researcher at the Rikyo University right now in Japan. He's specializing in Japanese philosophy, and we'll get to this, among many other things. And he's married to Japanese better half. And then he has a son. So he has more than academic reasons why he has to be there. And he's currently based in Kyushu, not Kumamoto, right?
Oita?
Oita, sorry. He's based in Oita, Japan. Now he's postdoctoral researcher at the Rikyo University in Tokyo, but because of the COVID-19, everything is kind of organized online. And Dr. Shuttleworth is the author of a book that published by Bloomsbury, and I'm going to share the screen real quick. He's the author of The History and Ethics of Authenticity, Meaning, Freedom, and Modernity. First of all, Kyle, welcome to the Tokyo Philosophy Project. Thank you for coming to this mosaic co-organized event. So today, first 20 to 30 minutes, I'm going to have a series of questions and basically discussion with you. And second half, we will just open up the questions, Q&A with the Indonesian students and from around the world. First, can you tell us about yourself? Maybe you can briefly introduce yourself from your perspective and maybe a little bit of introduction to this book.
Okay, so I'm originally from Northern Ireland in a city called Belfast, and my undergraduate degree was in philosophy, and it was predominantly analytic philosophy, but we had one module on existentialism, and that really grabbed my interest, and I ended up writing my dissertation on authenticity in Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Heidegger. So after that, I decided to pursue continental philosophy further. So I went to Warwick University in England, where they specialize in continental philosophy. And so I worked on Nietzsche, Hegel, Heidegger, and existentialism further there. So after that, I then went to Japan for 2 years and in Kyushu. And I then returned to education and I did my PhD back at Queen's University again, where I began. And it's where I began this project. And initially, so having lived in Kyushu, I wanted to combine my interests of philosophy and Japan. So I started looking into Japanese philosophy. And initially, I began reading Fukuzawa Yukichi. And Fukuzawa is actually from, he was born in Oita, where I'm currently residing, in a small town called Nakatsu. But having read Fukuzawa, I realized that he's not really a Japanese philosopher. What I was interested in was something which was distinctly Japanese, but Fukuzawa was essentially doing liberal political thought. So he was more interested in sort of equality, and he was ahead of his time insofar as he wrote essays on sort of the equality of women, which was a novel idea in Japan at that time. So initially, I got interested in ethics and I started looking at WATSUJI Tetsuro, a Japanese ethicist, and I intend to write my PhD thesis on WATSUJI and existentialism, or combining these ideas. And whilst there, I started thinking further, and especially with the help of my doctoral advisors, and I realized that what I was really interested in was this question of meaning, and how in the modern world that we've actually, especially in the West, it seems that we don't really have any given direction or purpose. So I then came across this notion of authenticity, which was central to the existential thinkers. And I started looking further into that. And so in my book, The History and Ethics of Authenticity, I developed my own idea of what it means to be authentic. So I look at contemporary culture and how this notion has become what seems like a prominent ethical ideal in Western thought. That it seems that, so it's an ethical ideal insofar as it seems that to be authentic is the most important thing. And we can think of pop cultural movements like hipsters who seek out originality. And there's also been a boom in what's called sort of self-help books. So I kind of look at these ideas and look at the philosophy beside them and determine that these aren't really notions of authenticity, but nevertheless, there's still attempts to get closer to what it means to be ourselves and find meaning and give ourselves our own direction in an otherwise absurd world. So having developed my own idea, I then look at alternative ethical ideas. So I look at sort of the virtue ethics as espoused by Alistair McIntyre, discourse ethics as advocated by Jürgen Habermas, and care ethics as espoused by Foucault. But rather than just saying, look, authenticity is better than these ideas for such and such a reason, I take something from each of them. So I develop my own account in dialogue with these other thinkers. And then I go on to look at, having sort of developed my idea a bit further, suggest that nevertheless, there's still problems with living authentically in modern society, and how the notions of the concept of capitalism impinges upon that, insofar as there seems to be a distrust of whether we can really be authentic, because this notion's become so prevalent that people try to capture the essence of this idea and sell it. So we may think that maybe when you're younger, or even now, you have a favorite singer or songwriter, and you just really identify with that person. But then perhaps you learn that what you really liked about them and what you felt spoke to you was actually the result of a marketing team who realized that, okay, there's a particular demographic, they're spending the most money, this is what they're interested in. So then they craft this personality of a songwriter. So when we learn these things, then we kind of feel disillusioned, and we lose a sense of sort of distance or connection. So we lose this idea of whether we can be authentic. But then we know
that's the similar to the recent discovery of the data mining and how that affected the voting for the Brexit and also the American presidential election, where people thought that they actually made a decision on their own, but it was heavily influenced by these
like fake news
advertisement and all with this information feeding, right? Yeah. Sorry,
yeah,
go
so
ahead.
that brings me on to the one. So then, because of the development and the increasing reliance upon technology, it seems that more of our interactions are now taking place online through social media platforms like this talk, for example. So traditionally we would have met in a university and would have only been academics, but it's become opened up now. So it seems that, well, perhaps the internet provides us with the ideal location to become authentic. We can try multiple personalities. We can sort of experiment with who we think we are, or what we want to become. And in that degree, I kind of looked at psychological studies as well, which show that actually, to use Foucault's concept, that the internet's a kind of panopticon, in that there's a psychologist, Sherry Turkle, so she gives an example of a teenage girl who writes some flirty comments on Facebook and gets lots of likes. So that kind of boosts her confidence, but then she tries to say something intelligent in the next post, but doesn't get as much attention. So they then downplay that aspect of themselves and instead sort of the flirting sort of aspect. So we kind of create caricatures of ourselves. So rather than actually representing, we're kind of shaped by other people's expectations or what we think other people want to see. So in this sense, that even if we try to be authentic, we're kind of pressured down by other people to create an image which is more marketable or which other people expect from us or want to see. So that's really the essence of the book, looking at sort of course, look at the history of this idea, like where it came from as a reaction to the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment ideal was that we were moving towards increased freedom. And we can see that in philosophers such as Kant and Hegel, who say this rational end to like human civilization of increased freedom throughout history. But ironically, we see like Nietzsche's The Cultural Death of God and Max Weber's notion of sort of increased rationalization, pointing out the negative consequences of the Enlightenment. And that's where we then get so this existential idea of this emphasis on individuality, that when we kind of move away from these hierarchies where we have meaning, especially in like Western society, when everybody becomes equal, although that's good because, yeah, of course, other people would have been sort of repressed in history, but they're not now. But again, we kind of lose a sense of meaning as sort of the claim of the existentialists and Nietzsche and Weber as well.
Okay, so I think you're giving me so much to go on already.
It's quite a lot in the book.
I mean, if you look at the table of contents right on the screen, you could already tell that each section could turn out to be a book. You know, what is modernity? That's a huge question, for instance. But so my understanding is that you're using this concept of authenticity and look at the different existentialism, psychoanalysis, as well as ethical theories to show that there's underlying issue of what counts as authenticity that we can learn from all the different disciplines. So it's kind of cross-disciplinary within the philosophy or cross-sectional understanding of what it makes us to be an authentic human being. But before getting into that, I'm interested in this statement that is that Fukuzawa Yukichi is not really a Japanese philosopher. Like, I think I understand what you mean, but can you elaborate a little bit on that and then maybe contrast how, in your eyes, Watsuji, is he our, you haven't got to the Watsuji yet, but you're the specialist of Watsuji and you are translating Watsuji as we speak. So it's safe to say that you are the leading scholar of Watsuji in Japanese philosophy and world philosophies today. But would you say that, hey, Watsuji is a Japanese philosopher, but the Fukuzawa Yukichi isn't quite? Or what are the conditions in which you say there are elements of Fukuzawa Yukichi is not quite Japanese philosophy?
Okay, so you know, in philosophy, it's neatly divided up into different categories, and traditionally in the Anglosphere and a British, American, Australian university, you're going to be taught there's analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. So these are the two types. As I said, my undergraduate degree was in analytic philosophy, and then I went on to pursue a master's degree in continental. So there's kind of a stigma that is only that which kind of comes from a Greek lineage constitutes philosophy. So, of course, we have other traditions, and it's a very close-minded view that there can only be sort of philosophy from the West. And of course, there are traditions in sort of like India, there's African philosophy. And when I suggested that Hokuzawa isn't a Japanese philosopher, what I meant was that he wasn't doing something which could be understood to be Japanese philosophy, which is indigenous to Japan, but rather he was working within sort of that tradition of sort of the Anglosphere, or from the Greek lineage. And what sort of drew me to Watsuji, aside from being sort of the leading scholar in sort of Japanese ethics, is that he sought to create a new idea of what Japanese philosophy is. And I think this is through his own life. So Watsuji was born in 1889 in the Meiji period. He lived through the Taisho period and in the Showa. So it's through like 3 different generations or decades. And I mean, if you study Japanese history, what you'll see is that Meiji period is defined as sort of this intersection or this coming together with the West, where everything sort of European or Western sciences, different ideas start to be introduced to Japan. And a lot of European scholars kind of criticized the Japanese at that time, like Carl Leuven, saying that basically Japanese were just taking on everything uncritically. And although that may not be the case, definitely when we get to the Taisho period, there's a change in the tides where we start to see criticisms of Western things and seek to return to traditional Japanese ways of life. And again, this may be connected to Watsuji's own experience of living through these cultural shifts in Japan. But we see that, I mean, in his own career, so he wrote his dissertation on Schopenhauer. His first book was on Nietzsche, the second was on Kierkegaard. But then when we get to his third book, Guzo Cycle, or Revival of Idols, then we start to see him developing or turning to Japanese culture. So I don't think it's as simple as that Watsuji only looked at philosophy and then turned to Japanese philosophy. If you read his book on Nietzsche, it's very much Buddhist. So he already had this sort of idea in mind. But we can see what Watsuji is trying to do is bring together these ideas.
There's a negotiation between 2 different ways of thinking, for instance, to solve with one problem or something like that. And you're right. I think the Mariyama Masao and Kato Shuichi, is that right? They talk about the translations, and when they talk about Fukusai, they do talk about how the Fukusai is much more like enlightenment, pragmatist thinker that is doing the Western project in the context of Japan, rather than you have Watsuji where there's this strong negotiation between there's things that the Western philosophy is definitely shedding light on, but the problems that he actually shows might be approached from different perspective, which is East Asian and Japanese perspective that Watsuji, for instance, is tacking on, right? This is another interesting thing. You talked about the relationship between authenticity and meaning. And, you know, traditional authenticity, you have structural meaning is such that whenever you talk about I or you or he or she or they, right, that subject would have a place in which we can actually talk about its meaning. right? So there's this preset notion of what counts as me, for instance, and a lot easier for them, I don't know, depends on where we are today in a personal perspective, but let's say it's in the past, they would have an easier understanding of authenticity and their meaning of their discourse. But then in postmodern philosophy or contemporary world, you're saying that these structure is flattening, right? And then it seems like whatever I claim to be is going to be the foundation by which I can claim my sort of like quote, like scare quote authenticity. Would you agree with that sort of bleak worldview? Or like, it seems like to me, right? It seems to me, the Watsuji is saying like, look, the structure of language that we speak already has set norms such that, yeah, it's a dynamic and a fluid, and we have to always negotiate with each other to understand what we mean. But that doesn't deprive us from this sort of normative, you know, intersubjective normativity, as it were, right? That there's ways in which we could actually mean and communicate and become authentically meaningful. Do you see that in Watsuji, and also do you see that in your analysis of other ethical theories, like you talked about virtue ethics and discourse ethics and care ethics? Do you see, how do you play that sort of the relationship between that way of understanding of Watsuji and other ethics?
So let's begin with this notion of individual authenticity. So this is what we associate with existentialism.
Yeah.
It's kind of starts notion of sort of like radical freedom and just developing as an individual. Maybe like a certain other wouldn't agree with that and take it as a simplification, but that's kind of the idea that we have of existential authenticity, and that's what Charles Taylor kind of criticized. He said there's something really important about this concept of authenticity, but the way it's presented or it's taken to be from the existentialists is the wrong way of going about it, because we don't exist as individuals in a vacuum. That from sort of being born, being raised, we're already taught sort of values by learning a language, by interacting with our parents. And for Taylor, that like, even if we did leave our community and isolate ourselves on a hill somewhere, like we still engage in imaginary dialogues, insofar as whenever we are going to make a decision, we may think about like, oh, like what would my grandfather have done? So we're still in dialogue with someone, even though they're not there, because we have a concept of them and we're kind of engaging with that. So, I mean, there are sort of similarities with what authenticity has become as an ethical ideal. So that's what Taylor wanted to do. He wanted to develop into an ethic, whereas with the existentialist, it isn't really. It's kind of like a mode of existence. So Taylor kind of talks about, well, to be authentic is to give our sort of lives meaning, but we can only give our lives meaning in relation to other people, because things only gain significance in a cultural horizon or in society. So we could kind of draw out a concept of authenticity in Watsuji's thought in that respect. But mentioned previously, Watsuji's kind of on a project to bring together different traditions, and his own thought is underpinned by the Buddhist concept of emptiness. And so in Rinrigaku, his book Ethics, there he talks about this like honraise, this and notion of this home ground within which we kind of find ourselves. So for Watsuji again, sort of course, he was writing before Taylor, and so he talks about, so he criticizes the Western concept of individuality as he sees in the likes of Immanuel Kant, and says it's the wrong way of thinking about things, because we can't just exist as like individuals, because if we try to do that or only focus on individuality, we negate our sense of community. And again, like, so he also criticizes Asian sort of ethics like Confucianism, which only focus on sort of the group.
Mhm.
He says, like, we only focus on sort of the community, then we lose our sense of individuality. So we exist in sort of both of these respects. So for Watsuji, then human existence is like a dual aspect. And it's
Yeah.
why, so rather than affirming one or the other, Watsuji's idea is to negate both. And that's what leads us to Honraisei, or this home ground of existence, and which could be interpreted as a concept of authenticity with
Yeah.
or
I
Buddhist
have
influence.
maybe I could give a little more like the concrete example of trying to understand this individual authenticity. Right. First of all, there's a reason why we are not using the term like a good or the moral that the history of ethics tends to talk about, because it insinuates a certain concept that are not helpful for this kind of discussion of this Watsuji on into subjective conception of ethics. And let's jump right into this concept of betweenness that he pushes forward and said the authenticity, right, can be defined in relation to the interrelationality of your existence, right? So whoever you are having a conversation with, wherever you're growing up, will have constitutive relation to your understanding of what counts as your authentic self, right? I hope I'm not making a mistake here. And so my question, right, the example that you use, this teenage girl who posts something and then get this instantaneous affirmation from the crowd with comments that are not necessarily intelligent, and then you have intelligent comment that should be encouraged for, or maybe I'm not going to say it should be encouraged, but it wasn't encouraged, right? So does the Watsuji ethics of betweenness, or this conception of authenticity in the context of Watsuji's ethics, does that promote a certain kind of betweenness? Like to say, we need to create a space in which this person could fully explore herself to become full authenticity, or his conception of betweenness is like, see what happens. You know, it's almost like this is just the way she cultivates herself, and you just have to let it be. So I guess my question is the relationship between authenticity and responsibility. You know, is there a certain responsibility that emerges from this conception of betweenness? Or so it's ultimate question of like, where does the normativity begins and description ends, and where the description begins and normativity ends, and what's ethics is always challenging for me. So my question is, does this conception of authenticity that you're describing in relation to Watsuji, does that introduce this responsibility and a certain kind of normativity of like, say, we need to protect a space for this person to be able to become fully interrelational?
So with this notion of Honraisei, or which is translated as authenticity, for Watsuji, all it really entails is the realization that we're not simply an individual, or we're not simply part of the community, but we're kind of neither. That we exist in Aidagata, or betweenness. And in the second volume of his Rinmigaku, the second volume of his ethics, he kind of illustrates the concrete application of this. Kind of, we get sort of the normative sense, but it's through the concept of trust. It's through trust and sincerity, or truthfulness. So in a book which was written before his ethics, translated as Ethics as a Study of Human, or Ethics as a Study of Ningen, Watsuji tries to develop this idea, and he does so in relation to different prominent theorists. So he looks at it in relation to sort of Buddhism, Confucianism, and then he has dedicated chapters to Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, Marx, for example. And we can really see that Watsuji's ethical thought is a combination of sort of these different historical accounts that we find in sort of Aristotle and Confucius and Hegel. So he's kind of influenced by Hegel insofar it's the dialectical approach. It develops. So and it's Confucian because it's always in sort of a different relationship. So in Confucianism, there's this idea of the 5 bonds. So the relationship between husband and wife, father and son, the eldest child and the youngest child, the ruler and the subject, and friend and friend. So Tsuji does something similar insofar as he says, look, the smallest social totality or group is sort of a relationship between 2 people. So he's, because of his notion of betweenness, like we don't exist as individuals, we always exist in relationships. And he says, we develop ethically whenever we are sort of like truthful and are sincere in relation to someone else's trust. So for example, with a couple or a husband and wife, so when sort of the husband is sort of like truthful and sincere to the wife's trust of sort of not cheating or not being looking for like other extramarital affairs, and they develop as a couple. So, and again, in each of these relationships, we kind of it grows from sort of the particular to the total, from the relationship between 2 people, and then when the couple have a child, the relationship changes from being a sexual relationship to being mediated for their love for the child. So they've shared, and then again, so the relationship with the children develops when, for example, your parents allow you to like stay out late. They say, right, okay, like you have to be home by like 10 p.m. So if you're kind of sincere and you do as you're told, then they're going to like trust you to stay out late again. But if you don't, then that's going to harm your relationship. So you're not going to develop or flourish in that sense.
Yeah.
Watsuji also has the concept of virtues within each of these relationships. So we move from the family of sort of the couple and the child to the local community, to the cultural community, to the state. So it's constantly moving out from sort of the particular to a wider social grouping.
Yeah.
So for him then,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's kind of what is sort of ethical is kind of being like, truthful or in relation to someone else's trust. So that's develop as individuals. That's how we develop ethically. Yeah, by not betraying somebody else's trust. So for religion, then, like trust is the very foundation of all relationships. So for example, so he gives the account of walking through a crowd. So we have to trust that other people aren't going to attack us. So if we can't even expect that, then how can we have a relationship with other people? Or like a taxi driver, for example, so they have to trust that the person they're giving a ride to is going to pay the fare. So if they, then they're not going to be able to sort of work as a taxi driver because they're not going to be able to trust sort of people to pay them and then be able to make a living. I think so.
Even the business transaction, you must have this sort of mutual recognition and trust must take place for us to actually make that transaction. Okay, so maybe I'm gonna be but by the way, feel free to post questions on the chat, so we will revisit later in a following section. So I can feel that some people already have a series of questions about these issues. So what are the benefits of working with this, let's say Kantian or Hegelian framework of ethics, and especially Kantian framework, is that capacity to provide a guideline without being bogged down with these particular cultural differences, right? So the particular truthful, sincere relationship between friends in Europe or European husband and your Japanese wife could be different from friendship between Indonesian friends, right? Because of the cultural context is different, cultural norms are different, climates are different, which is a huge notion that the Watsuji actually tries to talk about the relationship between climate and culture. So one of the benefits of the Western framework of thinking, like Charles Taylor's authenticity, or the Kantian notion of moral, or Hegelian notion of ethics, is to be able to provide the standard that is not subject to empirical facts, right? That's one question. So do you think Watsuji's authenticity, the sincerity, truthfulness, and trust has a certain framework that is not subject to any cultural differentiations? That's one question. And I guess let's start with that. I think it's a lot. Yeah. Let's start with it. That's one question, but I think, yeah, can you say that, look, the Western ethics is actually in conflict with the Watsujian ethics, or there's something common between them, or something like that?
So in the way Watsuji develops it, so I mentioned that we go through these stages of sort of the family to the local community and then the cultural community.
Mm-hmm.
But in the cultural community, Watsuji talks about so what's unique to different cultures, kind of their language, their art, their scholarship. But he says here as well, it's the development of religion.
Mm-hmm.
And then we move on to this other totality of the state or the nation. So he's kind of showing that different communities, they do develop in different ways. But I think what he wants to show is that nevertheless, we still have these notions of like trust and sincerity are foundational to them, despite that there are sort of like cultural differences which appear.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that for Watsuji, it is still something universal which he's presenting, but it leaves room for sort of the different cultures to emerge and develop and flourish without being sort of having conflict between what it means to be a good person or what ethics entails.
Yeah. Okay, maybe that's a great answer. Then I would like to have a follow-up question based on that. What is the sort of the strength of Watsujian ethics in that regard? Do you think, like if you study Kantian ethics in Europe or North America or Japan, it doesn't really matter where you study. You get the same format, categorical imperative, metaphysics and moral. It's just the same format, and then you have the same project. But it seems like if you do Watsujian ethics in the context of, let's say, UK, where you study, or you do in the context of Kyushu, even in a local district, right, of Japan, which is big enough to surpass some of the state economy in Europe. Do you think Watsujian ethics has this capacity to accommodate much more concrete, the cultural differences and historical differences? Or so this is a question, right? Is that a danger? Because it is the strength, but it's also a weakness. But how would you describe the strength of Watsujian ethics in that regard?
So I think when someone reads Watsuji's ethics, his book, Rinrigaku, that I think we're immediately looking for a formula, as we find Western thoughts of like Aristotle, like virtue is the mean between sort of excess and deficiency, or like Kant's categorical imperative, or like a utilitarian principle, like seeking sort of the good. But we don't have that, and I think that's actually a strength. So rather than a weakness, so we look for these like formulas that we can sort of like apply. But again, the reason why in Western thought there exists so many different formulas, like they're all in competition. There's not one which is agreed upon. So I see that Watsuji is providing us with something more foundational in that regard.
I see. It's a different kind of foundation, right? When the Kantian conception of foundation, there would be something so, I wouldn't say abstract, but it's so pure in a sense that if you move the Kantian framework of ethics from one culture to another, it should actually operate in the same way. And therefore, we can actually claim something like the universal human rights. That's the strength of Kantian ethics, I think. But it seems like you're suggesting that the WATSUJIan ethics is much more foundational in a sense of, like, we just look at what's going on in a particular family or particular society, particular culture, and particular historical period. And, you know, we can talk about specific interrelations in that regard, something like that. Yeah.
I mean, that's,
yeah.
I mean, they're taking like a dialectical approach. And the thing is with Hegel, so once you kind of accept one premise, you're locked into the end. You can't just criticize halfway through. It's either the beginning or nothing.
Yeah.
And we're just kind of doing something similar by taking sort of like a dialectical approach and showing how there's this sort of constant development. So once you accept sort of the beginning, then it logically follows.
Yeah.
Whereas with sort of the Kant's utilitarianism, so again, I'd take the German approach of distinguishing ethics and morality. So morality is to do with sort of the questions of justice or right, which I see as sort of utilitarians and sort of Kantians being applicable to, whereas ethics is about sort of the good life, as we find in Greek thought with sort of Aristotle, that what does it mean to live well? And I think that WATSUJI is kind of, again, it's an ethicist in that sense, and that it's about sort of how we live well as individuals, rather than what does it mean to be, or what is justice, or what is right. And so we kind of need those sort of abstract principles for sort of justice and right, whereas ethics, kind of, it's not just applying something to situations within which you find yourself. It's a life-term.
So it is a combination of ethics and existentialism in that regard of, because he's asking the question of, you know, what is to be good or what is to be just. He's asking question of what is to be human being, right? That what is to be human. That seemed to implicate the possibility that yes, we are going to screw up. Right? there are moments in which you would actually break the trust, and you know, we become insincere, but it's the whole package. We have to take a look at it and learn how to become human being. And for that, you pay attention to the concept of authenticity and as a framework to kind of bridge the WATSUJIan ethics and ongoing discussions in the context of ethics in Anglo-European academia. Yeah. Now I have this moderator keep sending me the message that 1 minute left, time's up. Be authentic to the time frame that we have. So we have to, unfortunately, we have to actually finish this interview with Kyle Shuttleworth for the Tokyo Philosophy Project. Thank you so much, Kyle, for this really, really fascinating conversation. And also, many of what he has talked about can be found in the History and Ethics of Authenticity, Meaning, Freedom, and Modernity from Bloomsbury. So check out that book, and also feel free to contact him. And so this is the end of Tokyo Philosophy Project. See you next time.